Yo, what's up everyone? My name is Zenitsu, and we are back with another Digimon video. So today, I am going to be doing a more topical video. This is not going to be as scripted as some of my others. This is mostly just going to be me rambling on some thoughts because something was brought to my attention that really got me thinking. And it was Yu-Gi-Oh! Got a new format. So, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that has a lot of parallels to Digimon, in terms of it being an internal-based game, it having a ban and restriction list, obviously, and the games being both at incredibly high power levels and power thresholds. So what Yu-Gi-Oh! Decided to do, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that, similarly to Digimon, the core rules and foundations do not really leave a whole lot of good room for alternative formats. So, like, with Magic, you have Commander, which is a 100 singleton. You have 60 card constructed between Legacy, Vintage, Pioneer, Pauper, Standard. So, like, there's a ton of different ways to be able to approach Magic as a game. Similarly with Pokemon, I know Pokemon has, like, an expanded and it has its standard. But Digimon only has one format. And we've seen through, like, regulation battles and ultimate cups and a whole bunch of other, like, experimentation, they've been trying to play with the rules and see what they can possibly do to try to create an alternative way to approach and play the game. Because I think for the longevity of a game, you do need to have more than just the standard way of playing. At least, like, for keeping players' interests, and the only big problem is, like, the way Bandai currently is set up with all of their different games, running a secondary format is actually incredibly difficult, and the reason why none have actually stuck is because Bandai probably wouldn't even support it even if it came to light. So, like, you look at Bandai Card Fest just as an example, and with, 7 games being ran, I don't necessarily see them including a 8th game, which is one of their other games that actually has, like, a dedicated secondary format. Because I know One Piece is getting rotation as, like, just an example, and with that means that there's the opportunity between rotation and legacy. So, like, everything versus just what's currently in the standard environment. So, there's essentially developed 2 different ways to play One Piece, even though standard is going to be the supported way. Similarly to how Pokemon doesn't really, like, actually play its legacy format, but it's there and the possibility is there. So, why am I bringing up GENESYS for Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, it's because the rule set of GENESYS actually is the most interesting thing for GENESYS, and I feel like looking at this rule set, Digimon can actually do a GENESYS format, but better. And it's going to take a lot of work, whoever decides to do this. I'm not saying I'm the specific guy to be able to do this. I could, given enough time, but it is an incredibly high amount of work that went into the creation of this format, and I have a lot of respect for Yu-Gi-Oh! For attempting this. And I'm using the word attempt loosely because we haven't really seen anything come from GENESYS yet, outside of, like, maybe Yu-Gi-Oh! Players' general reactions and responses to the format as a whole, but we haven't really seen what this format actually means for the game when it comes to a competitive level. So, as far as the GENESYS rules, the first one doesn't really apply to Digimon because we don't really have extra decks. So this is just them playing with, like, extra decks and an alternative card type. So yeah, that rule really doesn't apply. But the second rule is where things kind of get interesting. So just like any game, like any competitive game, there's going to be imbalanced cards are broken, and the game needs to be fixed. So that's why bans and limits are really important, is to try to fix the game. So them basically removing those bans and limits is incredibly interesting because of just what that opens up and what that means. So with Yu-Gi-Oh!, the big thing on why this is probably really good for them is because they have bans, limits, and semi-limits. So that means you have to keep track of what card is on what specific list, and that gets really annoying, especially as the card pool deepens and develops and more cards get added to said list. So this basically removes all of that, so you just have to keep track of one list, and that's the point buy list, which leads us into point number 3, is because there's no bans and limits, they're just not going to have, like, the most broken format you could possibly imagine, which is just unrestricted. Yes, technically that is its own format, but nobody really enjoys it because it's just tier 0 garbage, and it's just the game at its most degenerate. But with the idea of unlimiting everything and then limiting it through a point buy system, that creates interesting deck building opportunities and can be used as its own balancing tool because they could change how the points work to be able to get a more desirable outcome when it comes to how the game is supposed to flow. So, like, what I mean by flow is, like, the bobbing and weaving between players. Like, player A does this, which leads to this, which leads to this, and then where does basically the combo kind of stop? And is the combo so degenerate that's going to lead to, like, uninteractive and uninteresting gameplay? So I think that Digimon really could benefit from just unrestricting all of its cards, because if you look at our ban and restriction list, we only have 3 cards currently banned in our game, which I don't necessarily think we need a whole bunch of bans, but the fact that we only have 3 cards banned is very interesting in of itself, and everything else is chosen to be restricted to 1. So that means that if everything's just restricted to 1 basically anyway, unless a card is, like, so overtly broken or leads to broken interactions that it needs to be put on an actual ban, that, like, these don't sometimes even matter. So the fact that, like, a lot of these cards are restricted to 1, and a lot of these cards still see a lot of play, definitely is an interesting thing, and why I think the point buy system actually could work out in Digimon's benefit. So you could have, let's just say, Anubismon be worth a specific amount of points to where you could run reasonably 2 Anubismons in your deck. But then there comes the interesting deck building prospect of, oh, if I'm running Anubismon, that means I might not be able to run something like a Garurumon X Antibody. So you have to still pick and choose which broken cards, and based on the points, which broken cards of what quantities you're actually able to run. And that does make for interesting deck building decisions and opportunities. So yeah, that's the big point that I like when it comes to a game like GENESYS and how Digimon's ban and restriction list currently is set up, because it feels incredibly bad when you see a blue player running a 1 of Ice Wall, a 1 of Hammer Spark, they're 1 of Buko, they're 1 of Ukomon, they're 1 of Lobo, they're 1 of Mirage, all in the same deck, and you just feel like, because of how consistent Digimon decks are, they always just manage to see their 1-ofs. Whether it's insecurity or it's just sheer draw power and search power out of the deck, they'll sometimes just always feel like they see their 1-ofs. And then you feel like you got luck sacked because they're running like 6 different 1-of cards, and all of them are hyper powerful and hyper egregious, and even though, like, some do have more impact than others, that's kind of, again, where I think a point buy system would actually do Digimon some benefit when it comes to just creating an alternative format. Because if we look at rule number 4, these points were designed for a specific point cap. So they're labeling their point cap as 100. But let's just say if Digimon wanted to and they adopted this type of a rule set, obviously depending on the TO and the type of event, they can mess around with that point cap. And then that can make for even more interesting deck building decisions to see, like, oh, now let's raise the point cap from 100 to 200 for this event. Well, now that allows you to run essentially double the amount of cards that are on the point list. So it is just a very interesting prospect to think of in terms of what that actually could look like for Digimon. So obviously they have this, like, ginormous list. Points will vary, but they do have some like commonality between certain points where it's just like you have your 10s, your 20s, your 50s, your 100s, your 33s. Granted, these are all taken into consideration the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh's playsets are 3-ofs, but still certain aspects could easily translate over to Digimon, where it's just like, okay, whatever this card is, I don't actually know what it is because I don't really play Yu-Gi-Oh! And I have a very small knowledge of Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point. So whatever this card is, basically they're saying you could run 3 of this card, but nothing else here except maybe a 1-pointer. So, like, that allows you to run essentially 4 cards on this list for your deck and then nothing else, because then you wouldn't be able to run any of this or any of this because it's exceeding the point threshold. And I think, like, from a balancing perspective, that's a pretty, I don't want to say unique, because, like, drafts kind of work in a similar way, like sports drafts and whatnot, where it's just like certain players are worth a certain amount of points and you can only have a certain amount of points into your draft. But I digress. It just feels like it's a pretty unique tool for TCGs to implore to actually start balancing their games. And I feel like Digimon definitely can benefit from that based on our ban and restriction list. Because let's just say, I'll just pick a random example that I know a lot of people care about. Let's just say Greymon X Antibody. So Greymon X Antibody might not be worth 100 points, where that way you could run 2 Greymon X Antibodies in your deck. But if you run 2 Greymon X Antibodies, because let's just say as a hypothetical, it's worth 50 points out of 100, then you're only able to run 2 Greymon X Antibodies, and you won't be able to run something like the Geo Greymon from BT13. So that lets specific decks be able to take advantage of the point system to be able to play cards that they might not be able to play at higher quantities that might make those decks function while still limiting the overall power and potential of that deck. Because let's just say, again, if we're using Greymon X Antibody as the example where it's worth, let's just say 50 points, you could run 2 of it, and now because you're running 2 Greymon X Antibodies, you can't run Gravity Crush. So it limits what you're actually able to do in other areas, so that way your power card is actually going to be the power card. It's going to be more impactful because of the tools that are limited around it. So it's just like, even let's just say the hypothetical, we could reduce the point cap. We could say, all right, you could run 4 of this card, but you can't run Gravity Crush in that same respect, because it's just like, oh, I'm running 4 of this card. And then obviously from what was mentioned to me, there are cards on this list that are not on the ban and restriction list, and certain cards probably follow like a specific rule set that Konami created to help ease the point system in terms of its creation. So let's just say, again, we just make Greymon X Antibody worth 25 points. You'll run 4 of it, and let's just say staple cards. Those actually now have a point system to it. So if you're running 4 Greymon X Antibodies, you might not be able to run Memory Boosts, Trainings, Scrambles, Medieval Gallants, Omnimon X Antibody. Like, does the exclusion of those cards from a deck now make it worth Greymon X Antibody being ran in instead? And I think that's the most interesting prospect to what a point buy system can do to create an alternative format for Digimon. Because I was playing around with creating alternative formats for Digimon for a while. You could even go onto my YouTube channel. I do have a couple of videos where I go over not only just Bandai's, but like one of my own. I've talked about it before in some of my other live streams, where like I do think, just like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Digimon would benefit from like a format break system. So, like, take a snapshot in time and then call that a format. So, like, my ideal one is obviously BT13, and then play around with the BT13 promos and bans and restrictions. And I think, like, that could be a really good and healthy format overall. Obviously, it would get a little bit stale because, you know, it eventually will get to the point of a solved format, but I feel like that's a good spot in terms of formatting to where it would make for a good and interesting gameplay experience. Whether you're playing like Mirage or Shine Greymon or whatever. So that's just, again, my own personal perspective of where a like Time Wizard type format or like a snapshot type format would fit into Digimon. But as the game has developed, obviously certain cards are getting hit more and more. And this is why I was thinking, like, maybe this actually is the solution to having a secondary format that I kind of would have liked. So I know for competitive events, if you go to like Bandai Card Fest, they have side events for like 3v3. Well, now they can have side events for this type of a format, a point buy system, and that would be their way to be able to support it so players actually can build unique and interesting decks outside of the deck building requirement of you can't have the same card as your partner, which means people just play different decks and nothing actually changes. So I think that's incredibly boring from my own opinion, but something like the point buy system definitely would be able to show off more flexibility, because let's just say Growlmon was like worth 10 points, then that allows you to run more of this card and then some of some other point cards. So I just like the prospect and idea of what it could bring. And it's not like the rules are set in stone, obviously. I have a couple ideas based on the ban and restriction list as far as like what would constitute a card qualifying for it actually having points. So then this, again, just goes to limit and balance some of the more unhealthier aspects where it's just like, oh, my deck is going to loop this one specific thing over and over again and be highly uninteractive, as well as take advantage of a whole bunch of like memory gaining staples to be able to just do my big combo in a single turn and not care about anything that the opponent does, while giving them no opportunity for them to actually respond. That is just the overarching macro of what Digimon is at this point, where it's just like, I'm going to be doing essentially one of three things. I'm going to go up into my high-level Digimon and lock the opponent out of the game, so it doesn't necessarily matter how slow my deck is moving. Obviously, the better ones are actually having some punch factor where they'll end the game in 2 turns the second they go up into their big boss monster, but either way, they're going to be trying to floodgate the opponent out of playing the game, or they're going to be OTKing the opponent, so that way they don't actually have time to respond to the OTK, or they're going to be setting up a card with so much immunity that you reasonably can't out it. So if we go over to, let's just, let me see if I can pull it up real quick. So let's go over to eggmanevents.com and look at some of the top performing decks. So we have, let's just say, Machinedramon. Again, this fits into the big uninteractable wall. Like, he is just a card you are not supposed to interact with. You look at Gallon X. Another big uninteractable wall, or he's OTKing you. He's kind of fulfilling 2 of those roles, which is why he's one of the better decks. You look at Megidramon. Again, OTK combo. You look at a deck like Mirage, or not Mirage. You look at Galaxy Loop, because Galaxy Loop uses Mirage. You look at Galaxy Loop, you look at Imperial, you look at Sakuya. What are all these decks doing? Big combo into Floodgate, and then tell the opponent they can't play the game, and then win in the preceding turn. Leviamon is kind of like the small little exception, where it is technically an OTK deck, but it's not really an OTK deck. It has the potential to OTK with the correct setup, but it's supposed to be this more weird control deck, but I'll just, for ease of sake, just label it as an OTK deck because it does have that damage potential. You look at Genkumon X. Uninteractable stuff. Like, I'm just going to create an uninteractable wall and tell you you can't play the game. You look at Purple Hybrids. Purple Hybrids, I guess, is like the other kind of exception where it's just, it's not an OTK deck, but it's doing something very similar to Megidramon, where it's just like, I'm going to create this little loop. My Digimon is going to kill itself at the end of the attack, and then I'm just going to reset, and you're not going to be able to interact with me. So I'm just going to slowly chip you out, or just have, again, big combos because it's just using a whole bunch of additional rush bodies that it could play for free out of nowhere. So it'll try to like chip you and get enough value in resources to then lead into that hyper rush extra body gameplay. So you see a lot of these commonalities. You look at, again, Magnetic and Virus Imperial. Again, big OTK decks. So you could see these play patterns start to form and emerge with the current top string of highly popular and highly powerful decks. So I think a point system would be beneficial to be able to start nullifying them, which is why I think, like, just as some base ideas, you could start putting points on things that have rush. So like Promo Gallantmon or Gallantmon from BT13. So would this affect something like Royal Knights that uses Gallantmon from BT13? Not necessarily, but now you have to think about, if Promo Gallantmon or Gallantmon from BT13 now has a point associated to them, and you have a card like Royal Knights of the Purge have a point associated to them, well, now you might not be able to run both of those in the capacity that you would have wanted, which again goes to further limit and balance what a deck like Royal Knights was doing. And I think like that's super important and super valuable, because that could create not only just interesting decks on how to optimize your deck based on the points that you are allotted, but it also allows more creativity in decks so they're not all just super hyper homogenized. Because if you look at a lot of like generic staples and techs, you're seeing a lot of the same stuff. So like if you're a hyper aggressive deck that focuses on your rookies, or you don't care about digivolving past your rookies, you're throwing Ukomon in. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. You are throwing Ukomon in. And I think that's just incredibly boring, especially if you look at like a lot of stack-based decks. They're running memory boost, training, scrambles. Usually it's like 4 trainings, 1 or 2 scrambles, and 2 to 3 memory boosts. Like, that's almost 10 cards out of your deck that you didn't even have to think of when it came to deck building. So it just led to some uninteresting deck building, and then it also leads to uninteresting play patterns, because the play patterns behind those cards is, I'm just going to sit here and just delay my options, dig out all my parts and pieces for my combo, and then combo off and hopefully win the game. So a lot of decks, and when I mean a lot of decks, I mean a lot of stack-based decks are doing that. And like, yes, the counter argument is, well, not all decks are able to do that. So you look at something like CS, and they have a, in quotation marks, memory boost, but they don't have a training. And you look at DM, and they have a, in quotation marks, training, but they don't have a memory boost. So would those cards then have a point system attached to them? And I probably would say yes, but it would be worth less than the hyper generic stuff. So if you have a card like, we'll just use offense training, where that might be worth, let's just say in the hypothetical, 25 points. You'll have a card like Meat, where maybe Meat is worth 10 points. They're effectively covering the same type of role, but the DM decks aren't able to run the other hypergeneric staples, and then this still allows them to not only just run their staple as a 4 of, but have room for like some other broken synergies and strategies to be able to keep that deck somewhat relevant compared to some other decks. So maybe that's too harsh of a point analysis. I don't know. I really would have to go through with a fine-tooth comb and be able to set that up, which is an incredibly high amount of work. And that's why I have a huge props and respect for Yu-Gi-Oh! For actually doing that work for a lot of their stuff, which is probably why they decided to exclude certain card types, because they're just like, look, we can't reasonably evaluate these because they're just kind of stupid. But regardless, like, having certain parameters to have points warranting an assignment would definitely help make Digimon a more interesting and engaging game, versus let me just do my one thing and then hope the game kind of ends, or hope the opponent can't actually play. And to me, that's not necessarily the most fun and interesting gameplay. And I'm not like disparaging anyone who actually is enjoying the current state of Digimon. That's not the whole point of this. The whole point is to think of how to make Digimon better, and I think having a point system as an alternative rule set definitely could help make Digimon as a game better based on some of these metrics that we could assign points to. So it's just like, oh, I could run Garudamon, but because it gives Rush, maybe it's going to have a point system attached to it, especially since it's good enough to be on the ban and restriction list. So now maybe I won't be able to run the training cards. So that's a huge trade-off to think of just from a deck building perspective, and maybe this will actually allow other cards and other card types to warrant seeing play, because as you see with Yu-Gi-Oh's Genesis rule, not everything is going to have a point assigned to it. So there's already like a metric butt ton of cards, as you can see. I'm just keep scrolling, and there's a lot of cards that have points assigned to them. But basically they said anything that's not on this list, which this list has 538 cards. So yeah, that's a lot. Not everything on this list, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Obviously being a bigger game, means that whatever's left out won't have a points attached to them. So something like your generic searcher, like look at the top 3, add 1 of X trait and 1 of Y trait to your hand. Like those probably won't have any points attached to them, because I don't necessarily think those are warranting any points attached to them, and especially since none of those cards outside of like Gabumon is banned, but Gabumon is on here because of the protection, not necessarily because of the digging. I kind of just been rambling on about this factor and like this topic long enough. So feel free to tell me your thoughts about what a Genesis in Digimon would look like to you, and if you think that a Genesis type format in Digimon would actually be good. Because I'm on the side of this actually probably could fix a lot of my own personal issues that I'm having with the game if this type of a format did exist. And like, that's kind of why I'm in favor of it. But I'm always curious to hear the other side of the fence or other people's thoughts and opinions. So feel free to tell me those. And if you like this type of content and you want to see more, you already know what to do with the whole YouTube and social media doobly-doo. Leave that like, follow, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date when I upload or go live next. And thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Later.